It was 2 movies left. Everything is messed up. Welcome to Countdown to Infinity War.
Countdown to Infinity Wars.
You know what? Actually,
Countdown.
we're not doing the theme music this week. Forget it. Let's just get into this. Okay, so as you know, I'm counting down. I'm watching all 18 Marvel Cinematic Universe movies leading up to the release of Avengers Infinity War coming out on April 27th. And as I've been going through these movies, I've been trying to work out whether or not the timeline of the Marvel Cinematic Universe actually makes any sense. And so far, it's actually been pretty much straightforward until Spider-Man: Homecoming. Spider-Man: Homecoming has completely wrecked my timeline, and I don't know how to even express it. Usually at this point in the video, I'd be going, "Let's go and have a look at the timeline." I've not even bothered adjusting the timeline this week because the fact of the matter is I couldn't. As I was doing it, I was realizing there's no way that I can actually make this work. But I suppose I better start from the beginning here. Why has it all gone wrong? So the first thing I like to do whenever I'm looking at working out the timeline for one of these movies is seeing if there's any dates, actual dates in the film. And in this one there is, and there's the first one we see is in the poster for the decathlon, which says it will take place on October the 13th to the 15th. Only later on in the movie, as we get closer to the decathlon, that exact same poster completely changes the date to September 14th. So now I'm going to give Spider-Man: Homecoming the benefit of the doubt here, because printing mistakes happen. It's one of these things. You go to make a poster, you send out the posters. I'll get all the schools, and then it turns out the wrong date's on the poster. Oh no! So you send out a whole bunch of other posters and send out a memo to all the schools letting them know that you've got the wrong date. It happens. It's one of these things that happens. So I'm ignoring that first one, the October the 13th to 15th. Why would you do something like that for 3 days? I don't know. And we're going to focus on the fact that it's September the 14th. Now, when I worked it out, the main body of the movie takes place over about 10 days. However, obviously, there is more that happens before those 10 days. Those 10 days kind of start from the moment Peter's having his first day. We see Peter at first day at school. More takes place 2 months before the main body of the film, which happens to take place at exactly the same time as Civil War. The events of Civil War, we see the events of Civil War at the beginning of the movie with the fight in the airport, and the kind of cuts to him getting driven back to his house must be literally a few days after this battle. After the car ride is finished, we then see that 2 months passed, thanks to this handy little cue card here. But this is where we get to the actual problem of the homecoming problem, is what I'm going to refer to it as. The very opening of this film takes place after the events of the attack on New York. Okay. Now, in previous videos, we have confirmed that the attack on New York takes place in 2010. So, if that events take place in 2010, we then see this very exciting cue card that says 8 years later. So, if 8 years has passed since the attack on New York, then that means Spider-Man: Homecoming takes place in 2018, and therefore Civil War takes place in 2018. But it's already been said in the movie Civil War that where they are right now is 8 years after Tony Stark reveals to the world that he is Iron Man. Vision says it in one of his monologues. He says, in the 8 years since Iron Man revealed himself to the world. And Iron Man is set in 2018, which means that if it's 8 years after Iron Man, then Civil War is actually in 2016. And therefore, so was Homecoming. So there's the problem. and the problem is that I've been very trying to be very practical by making a timeline and putting bits of paper and sticking them on, and now I just don't know where to put the bits of paper anymore. I don't know how to actually say this is the events are happening, because I don't know if Civil War is taking place in 2016 or 2018, because the films are contradicting each other. It's kind of disappointing because I've been doing this for, well, since January, and it was so close. We were so close to getting to the end. All we had was Thor Ragnarok left, and that was going to be easy. I remember him saying something about it being 2 years after Age of Ultron, but that's fine. I just don't know. I guess I'm going to keep watching the movies. I'll watch Thor Ragnarok next week in preparation of seeing um, Infinity War. But I don't know. I guess I'm not really want to. I don't really feel like I want to do the timeline anymore. It doesn't make sense to do it anymore if it doesn't make sense. I've figured it out. I've figured it out. It makes so much sense. Of course. Of course. Right, okay. So, of course, we've just had the discovery through Doctor Strange of the Time Stone, right? So, what? Okay, we're not dealing with one timeline anymore. We're dealing with two, maybe even three, four, five, an infinite number of timelines that have had a butterfly effect all the way along based on certain changes in the timeline as it goes along, which shifts the timeline. I've worked it all out. I have worked it all out. I know exactly what's happened. Come on, I'm going to show you over this way. Come with. Okay, so here is the new timeline as I've managed to work it out. So let me just come in here and I'll show you what this is all about. So we're now dealing with two separate timelines, okay, that all stem and change and butterfly from this one moment in time. And that very important moment is December 16, 1991, the death of Howard and Maria Stark. So what happens in the top timeline, it's basically the one that we've been kind of following this whole time, okay? Where Bucky Barnes kills Tony's parents back in 1991, okay? And it sort of pans out pretty much the same, right to the point where we see that Civil War, this is the timeline where Civil War takes place in 2016 and Spider-Man Homecoming takes place at the same time at 2016. However, there is an alternative timeline, okay? And in this timeline, the very major difference that happens is that Bucky Barnes does not kill Howard and Maria Stark. What happens in December 1991 is that Howard and Maria Stark still die, but Hydra sends somebody else to kill them, who I don't know, but they are killed by somebody else, not Bucky Barnes. Bucky Barnes is sent on a different mission. He is sent to kidnap and assimilate Aldrich Killian. See, Aldrich Killian would be right at the beginning of his career in his early 20s at this point. And Hydra would be interested in him because of his interest in regenerative cellular technology. So what happens is Hydra want to kidnap him, want to assimilate him, and turn him into a Hydra person so that they can use his intellect for building their super soldiers, which is what Hydra are all about. This then has sort of a knock-on effect. So we see that so here we go, this is a 2008. Tony Stark still reveals himself that he's Iron Man 2008, no change there. Okay, it's the same 2008. In 2010, there's still the attack on New York in 2010. Where things change is in Christmas 2013, at the point where we see Iron Man 3. So in this, what we're getting in the top timeline is the Iron Man 3 that we've all seen, the one with the Mandarin and Pepper Potts being kidnapped and all the rest of it. But in the bottom timeline, what we're seeing is a completely different Iron Man 3, because Aldrich has been inducted by Hydra. So Tony Stark is not just fighting Aldrich Killian, he's also fighting all of Hydra as well, and there's super soldiers and all the rest of it, and it's very exciting. But unfortunately, it's one that we'll never actually see. Now what happens because of that is two things. First of all, and the main one, Hydra have kind of put all their eggs into Killian's basket with the whole super soldier thing. And I have not been working on Project Insight. Now in the top timeline, we see that in 2014, Winter Soldier happens, and that all kind of takes place. But in the bottom timeline, because Hydra are now set back with Project Insight, Winter Soldier doesn't take place until 2016. And the movie we're actually watching, when you sit down and put your Blu-ray of Winter Soldier in, is the version from the bottom timeline, the 2016 version, because there's nothing in that movie to tie it down to a specific date. We then see the events of Age of Ultron, and in this timeline again we're seeing it for 2017, a year after the events of Winter Soldier, which finally makes sense of the line where Captain America says that he's been frozen for 75 years. Now it's been 73 years actually in this timeline since he's been frozen, but he's rounded it up to 75. But it makes more sense than the version of Age of Ultron in the top timeline. Now in the top timeline, it's pretty much the same movie. It's a movie we'll never see, but it's the same movie with one difference, is that Captain America at the end of the movie shrugs and says, the guy that's been frozen went into the ice 70 years ago. So he says that in the other movies. That's the only difference between the top and the bottom Age of Ultron movies. Which then brings us to the events of Civil War. Now, in the top timeline, the Civil War we're actually watching at home is the one that's set in 2016, 8 years after Tony Stark reveals that he is Iron Man to the world. But there is an alternative Civil War, and in that Civil War, Vision says that in the 10 years since Tony Stark revealed himself to the world. Now, the other main difference, as we spoke about earlier, is that Bucky Barnes has not killed Tony's parents in this version of Civil War. So when the sort of final showdown comes up, Zemo's got an entirely different plan. Now what that plan is, I don't actually know. He could be using the super soldiers that were there. He might have some other idea in mind. But whatever it was, the results is the key here. The result being that by the end of this Civil War movie, that Tony Stark and Bucky Barnes and Steve Rogers, they don't have the fight at the end. They've got no reason to. now that Barnes hasn't killed Tony's parents. Everything else up to that point is the same. They still have the Sokovia Accords because Age of Ultron still took place. They still have the fight at the airport and everything like that. The only thing that changes is that right at the end, Steve and Bucky and Tony do not have a big falling out. However, Bucky Barnes and Steve Rogers are still having to go on the run. Which makes sense of the line in Spider-Man Homecoming about him saying that this guy is pretty sure that he's a war criminal now. This to me seems to make a little bit more sense because one of the things that bugged me about Homecoming, if Civil War kind of takes place, is that Tony just seems to come off rather flippant in the movie, like he hasn't really had a falling out with Steve Rogers. Also, the fact that they're hanging on to his prototype shield, and Happy just seems to be sort of casually mentioning that they've still got this prototype shield for Captain America. When they've had like a huge falling out, he's left the Avengers, which kind of doesn't make any sense to me. The other side of it is as well is that that him and Pepper Potts are suddenly back together again. But I have a theory about this. It's, as I was mentioning before in the alternative Iron Man 3, you see, I think the events of Iron Man 3, although they seemed romantic at the time when he blew up all the robots, blew up all the Iron Man suits, actually led to him and Pepper falling out and having a breakup, and so in Civil War, in the 2016 Civil War, we see that they've broken up. However, if the events that I'm saying in the bottom timeline, where it happened, and Tony has gone through sort of different experiences, maybe they haven't split up, and which kind of makes sense by the fact that they're together and about to propose to Tony's about to propose to Pepper right at the end of Homecoming. This is my theory. This is where I'm coming from at the moment. I just think that what's happening right now is that we're actually dealing with two different timelines. That when we watch the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you're not just watching movies from one single timeline, but movies that dart across different timelines and different channels of space. And I'm seriously considering that this is where we are actually right now. The next question is, where will Thor Ragnarok fall? Not only on the timeline, but will it fall into the top timeline or the bottom timeline? Only time will tell.